Welcome back to another episode of SmoothBrainEDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. We had an amazing time at MagicCon Vegas, and we're back to bring you more gameplay videos. While we were there, we got a quick game at the hotel with a kind of a jank setup, so let's see what we brought to the table. Our first player today is Seth on Zur, the Enchanter. This is an Esper cycling deck, hoping to churn through the deck with tons of cycling cards and blink creatures with Astral Slide. Up next is Karn on Tatyova, Benthic Druid. This is a Simic landfall deck, hoping to ramp out a ton of lands to draw a ton of cards and overwhelm opponents with value. There is Sam on Eriette of the Charmed Apple. This is an Orzhov Auras deck, hoping to enchant opponents' creatures to prevent attacks and drain opponents' life totals. Last up is Ethan on Karn, Legacy Reforged. This is a colorless deck that hopes to use Karn's mana ability to ramp out some powerful but expensive artifacts. We're about to hop right into the game, but before that, go ahead and give us a like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new content. We have links to our deck lists, our social media, public Discord server, and our Patreon in the description. We're partnered with Dragon Shield. Check out our affiliate link in the description if you'd like to pick up any sleeves, deck boxes, or playmats. Now, on to the gameplay.
Seth wins the die roll and he starts off with Rafine's Tower and then he passes. Caden plays Tide Channel Pathway into Elixir of Immortality and then he passes to Sam, who will play a Fabled Passage and then he'll pass to Ethan, who plays War Room into Sol Ring and then he passes back to Seth. Sam decides to fetch for a Plains on upkeep, and then Seth plays Remote Isle as land for turn, and then passes to Caden. Caden starts off with a Snow Forest, and then he'll tap for 2 and cast Skilled Herbalist, and then he passes to Sam. Sam will play Caves of Koilos, and then he'll tap for 2 and cast his Spellbook Vendor, and then he passes to Ethan, who plays Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, and then he'll tap for 4 to cast Thran Dynamo, then he taps it for 3 to cast Scrap Trawler, and then he passes to Seth. The whole table says, "Oh dear God, we need to deal with Ethan." Seth plays Morphic Pool and passes to Caden, who starts off with a Thespian Stage, then he taps for 3 and casts Cultivate. He gets a Snow Island to the battlefield and a Forest to his hand. He'll then activate his Herbalist to put Simic Growth Chamber onto the battlefield, which bounces his Snow Island to his hand. The turn is then passed to Sam and he starts off with Isolated Chapel. He'll then tap for 3 and cast his commander, Eriette, then he moves to combat and hits Seth for 2, and then he'll pass to Ethan, who starts off with a Sanctum of Ugin as land for turn, then he'll cast a Swiftfoot Boots. After this, he taps for 5 and casts Karn, Legacy Reforged, and then he'll pay the 1 to equip the booties. Ethan then moves to combat, and he hits Seth for 3 and Caden for 5 commander. The turn is then passed to Seth, and he starts off with Exotic Orchard, and then he'll drop Zur. He then passes the turn, and Caden starts off with his Snow Island. He then casts Druid class, and then he activates his Herbalist to put a Forest into play. He'll then pay 4 to level up his Druid class, and then he passes the turn to Sam. Sam starts off with Castle Ardenvale as land for turn, then he'll tap for 3 and cast Grim Guardian. Then he'll pay 1 white to enchant Zur with Spirit Link. After this, he moves to combat and he'll swing for 4 at Caden. After this, he passes the turn and Eriette triggers on end step and everyone is drained for 1. We then move to Ethan's turn and Karn triggers and he makes 5 colorless mana. He'll then play a Waste as land for turn, and then he'll tap for an additional 4 to cast Portal to Phyrexia. Caden will immediately deprive that though, bouncing Simic Growth Chamber. There was a Sanctum of Ugin trigger, and Ethan will accept it and sacrifice the land. He finds Solemn Simulacrum to his hand, and then he will cast it, finding another Waste to the battlefield tap. Ethan then moves to combat, and he swings for 5 commander at Sam, and then 3 at Caden, and they both take it. Ethan will then just pass the turn to Seth. And on upkeep, Seth casts Enlightened Tutor. He finds Fluctuator to the top of his library, and then he'll draw it for turn. After this, Seth will immediately move to combat, and he swings for 1 in the air at Ethan. Zur attack trigger. And with the trigger, he finds Astral Slide to the battlefield. And then he'll cast Fluctuator post-combat. Seth will then float a blue with Remote Isle, and then play his Azorius Chancery as land for turn, bouncing the Remote Isle back to his hand. Then he'll cycle the Remote Isle for free, and Astral Slide will trigger. He chooses to exile Zur, which makes Sam's aura fall off. Seth then passes the turn to Caden, and Zur comes back on end step. Caden then immediately taps for 5 and casts Tatyova. He starts his land's journey off with a Fabled Passage. He'll fetch for a Forest, and this will get him 2 Tatyova and 2 Druid class triggers. He'll then play a Terramorphic Expanse, and also fetch with it, this time for an Island, which gets him 2 more of each triggers. He'll then activate his Herbalist and put in his Snow Island. More triggers, yay! And then he'll cast Sakura Tribuilder. He'll then pass the turn having drawn 5 and gained 10 life. Now on Sam's turn, he starts off with his own Solemn Simulacrum. He'll find a swamp with it, and then he'll play Castle Lochthwain as land for turn. Sam then moves to combat, and this is the combat he decides to pay the 1 to Spellbook Vendor, and he puts a Sorcerer roll on Eriette. He'll then declare Eriette at Seth, who puts 0 in front of it and they bounce, but there is an attack trigger and Sam will scry 1. He leaves it on top and then the turn is passed to Ethan. Eriette trigger on end step because the roll tokens are auras. Now on Ethan's turn, he gains 6 Power Stone mana. He starts off with Temple of the False God, then he'll activate War Room to lose no life and draw a card. Then he'll cast Hedron Archive and he'll immediately crack it to draw 2 cards. He'll then cast Sculpting Steel and he decides to copy Solemn Simulacrum, but specifically Sam's Solemn Simulacrum because he likes the old border. And this finds him a waste to the battlefield. Ethan then moves to combat and swings Karn at Caden, and Caden will do Ye Old Steve trick. This gets him a Forest and Tatyova and Druid class triggers. Ethan then passes the turn to Seth, who starts off with a basic island. He'll then move to combat and swing for 1 at Sam, and he gets a Zur trigger. And he finds Faith of the Devoted to the battlefield. He'll then cast Arcane Signet, and then pass the turn to Caden, who starts off with a Lotus Cobra. He'll then play a Hinterland Harbor as land for turn, and he has 3 landfall triggers hit the stack. Seth decides to respond to them by cycling Fetid Pools. Astral Slide will trigger targeting Tatyova. Caden will respond by activating his Herbalist and putting Misty Rainforest onto the battlefield. This will draw him a card, gain him 2 life, and make him a green mana. He'll then fetch with it for an untapped Breeding Pool, which only net loses him 1 life, and he'll get a card and another green mana out of this too. We are back to Seth's triggers on the stack, and he'll pay 1 to Faith of the Devoted, and then Tatyova will be exiled till end of turn. Then Caden's original 3 landfall triggers will resolve, so he gains 2, draws a card, and makes another green. He'll then play Command Tower as land for turn, and misses his landfall triggers this time. He'll then cast Gretchen Twitch Willow, and he'll immediately activate her to draw a card, and he'll put Simic Growth Chamber onto the battlefield, bouncing a Forest. Triggers floating a green. Mans will then cast a Courser of Crufix. After this, he activates Gretchen again to draw the Lonely Sandbar on the top of his library, and he'll put it into play. Triggers. And the mana he floats doesn't matter because he passes after this. Sam starts off by casting Warehouse Tabby. Then he'll enchant Lotus Cobra with Screams from Within. And if you didn't realize it yet, Sam is going for a combo win. When the Screams kills the Lotus Cobra, the Screams will trigger, and so will the Warehouse Tabby, making a 1/1 rat, and then Sam will return the Screams to the battlefield onto the rat, which will kill it, which will trigger everything again, over and over and over. And the Grim Guardian will trigger each time, draining all of Sam's opponents out. But after the rat creation resolves, and still in response to the Screams, Ethan decides to tap for 2 and Spatial Contortion Warehouse Tabby to stop the combo. So then the Screams from Within will hit the battlefield, and since it's not being cast, it technically doesn't target, so Sam attaches it to Karn. And since 2 auras enter the battlefield during this interaction, each of his opponents lose 2 life. He'll then move to combat and pay 1 to a Spellbook Vendor to give his Grim Guardian a roll token. Sam will then pass through combat and then end the turn, Eriette triggers, and drains everyone for 3. Now on Ethan's turn, at the beginning of his turn, he makes 7 Power Stone mana, and he uses 3 to activate War Room again. He'll then play Inventor's Fair and then immediately crack it. Yeah, and he finds the One Ring to his hand. That's like the best card in every deck these days. And he'll immediately cast it, so upon ETB, he gains protection from everything till his next turn. And of course he'll activate it to draw a card. Ethan then moves to combat and swings both of his Solemn Simulacrums at Sam, and Sam will block both of them, one with his Sad Sam. So 3 Sad Sams will die, and 3 cards will be drawn. And Ethan's Scrap Trawler will trigger, and it sees the Sculpting Steel as a 3-drop and the Solemn Simulacrum as a 4, so he gets to return the Sculpting Steel back to his hand. Then after this, Ethan will cast a Might Stone and Weak Stone. It resolves, and upon ETB, he'll draw 2 cards. Ethan will then tap for 3 and cast Sculpting Steel, and copy his 3 in Dynamo, then he'll tap it for 3 to cast Rings of Brighthearth. And then he passes the turn to Seth. Seth will immediately move to combat, and he swings Zura at Sam. Attack trigger, and he finds Ominous Seas to the battlefield. And then he'll just pass the turn to Caden, who starts off with a Forest, triggers. Then he'll play Rimewood Falls as a second land, triggers. Then he'll cast Skyshroud Claim, finding 2 Snow Forests to the battlefield, double triggers. Caden will then tap for 8 and cast Awaken the Woods, X is 6. And this is where Seth decides to step in. In response, he cycles Radiant Judgment, triggers, Astral Slide exiles Tatyova, he'll pay 1 to his Faith of the Devoted, and then Ominous Seas gets a counter. After this, the Awaken resolves, and Caden makes 6 land dudes, and gains 12 life. After this, he'll activate Gretchen to draw a card, and he has no lands to put into play, but he will cast a Soul Ring, and then he passes the turn to Sam. Sam plays Rogue's Passage as land for turn, and then he'll tap for 1 and cast Skrelv. After this, he moves to combat, and he'll pay 1 to his Vendor, and he gives his Rat a Spellbook. Sam will then move to combat, and he swings 4 at Seth. 2 creatures with the Sorcerer roll attack, so he scries 1 twice, puts 1 to the bottom, and keeps 1 on the top. Sam will then activate Castle Lochthwain to draw a card and lose 3 life. Then he passes the turn, and Eriette triggers and drains everyone for 4. Now on Ethan's turn, he has 2 upkeep triggers, 1 to lose a life, and the other to make 9 Power Stone mana. He'll then activate the ring to add another counter and draw 2 cards. After this, he taps for 8 mana and drops Ugin the Spirit Dragon. Seth responds to the cast by cycling Rune of Protection red, triggers, and he'll exile Zur. Then he'll pay 1 to Faith of the Devoted, and then Ominous Seas gets another counter. Priority is then passed to Caden, and he decides to Fierce Guardianship Ugin. And then after this, Ethan drops Blightsteel Colossus. It resolves, and then he moves to equip Swiftfoot Boots to it. Seth decides to respond by cycling Rune of Protection green. Triggers, Astral Slide hits Blightsteel Colossus, he'll pay 1 to his Faith of the Devoted, and then Ominous Seas gets another counter. Ethan will then pass the turn, and Astral Slided creatures will return. And as Zur players usually do, they just immediately move to combat. He turns Zur sideways at Ethan, and then tutors his deck for an Out of Time. 19 creatures are phased out, and Out of Time gets 19 counters. Post-combat, Seth will cast Esper Sentinel, then he'll pass the turn to Caden, who cracks his Elixir on end step, gaining 5 life and shuffling his graveyard back into his library. On his turn, he casts Exploration, Miss Sentinel trigger, then he'll cast a Sky Shroud Ranger, and then he passes the turn to Sam. Sam will start off with a command tower, and then he casts a Core Spirit Dancer. He then activates Castle Lochthwain again to draw a card and lose 3. He'll then pass the turn to Ethan, and Ethan will lose 2 life on upkeep, and then immediately activate the ring again to put a counter on it and draw 3. And this finds him a Moonsilver Key, which he will cast. He'll then sacrifice it and tutor Basalt Monolith to his hand. Seth remembers his Esper Sentinel 1, and Ethan does pay for it. Ethan will then tap to cast the Basalt Monolith, and Caden responds with a Roiling Regrowth. Not paying for Esper Sentinel, he sacrifices a Snow Island and finds 2 lands to the battlefield tapped, then he gains 2. The Monolith will then resolve, and Ethan will tap it for 3, and then use that 3 mana to untap it. With the untap ability on the stack, Ringing to Brighthearth will trigger, and Ethan pays the 2 to have 2 untap abilities on the stack. This is a combo that can make Ethan infinite colorless mana. And there are no responses around the table, so that's what he does. He makes 1 billion colorless mana. He'll use 4 of it to cast Karn Living Legacy, and he downticks Karn, which lets you pay any amount of mana, and Ethan just pays how many cards are left in his library, and this essentially just lets him tutor Walking Ballista to his hand. He'll then cast Walking Ballista where X is 1,000,000, and then he'll ping everyone to death. And there's still no responses around the table, so Ethan and Karn are the winners. Congratulations! Well, there you all have it. That was a fun game, and we got to record it while in our hotel room in Vegas for you guys. What do you mean the turn 1 Soul Ring won the game? No. I'm just joking. Everybody got to do their game plan this game, and those are the most fun games if you ask me. If you guys enjoyed, let us know down in the comments below. While you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out all of our links in the description. But that's all for today, guys. I hope you all have a smooth day.